Hi guys. I was trying to find there for a second the camera. So we're going to start now with Hélène Cixous, The Laugh of the Medusa. I was reading here some of your questions, and they're really, really great. And they have to do a lot with the difference, I think, between feminism as it happened in France, and it keeps happening, right? And as it happens in the US, and also with the difference between 1975, when around the time that the text was translated, written and translated, and then our own time, right? So first, a brief introduction again, as we did earlier with Beckett, in this case with Hélène Cixous. So she's a French writer. She's known as a French writer, even though she was born in Algeria, right? And as I think I mentioned before in other instances of our class, like that's very common, right? Because of Algeria having been a French colony for such a long time, right? Up to the 60s. So a lot of writers, like we mentioned sometimes here and there, another philosopher, Jacques Derrida, also was born in Algeria and also went to France to study and so on. So in Lexicsu was kind of the same case. She's known, she's a thinker, writer, poet, script writer. Yeah, she's done like a lot, and she's known also as a part of like the first, or rather like the second, will be wave of feminism in France, right? So in France you will have Simone de Beauvoir, rather in the 40s, right? She wrote The Second Sex, which kind of has the major thesis, a very complex book and very important, but has the major thesis that woman is not born but is created, right, through society and culture, right? So Cixous is coming kind of from there, but going into a different kind of way of doing it, right? And especially coming from 68, which is very important in history. We mentioned it before, right? Like you have not only the context of the wars in Vietnam and the context of the beginning of the worst part of the Cold War, but you have also like this absolute revolution of values and especially of education, and especially in France in May of 68, right? So she's coming from there. She was born in 1937. So by that time she was in her 30s, right? So already thinking and writing, and she has had a great role in French literature and in theory. And in theory means like in a lot of literature departments in the U.S. Right? She still works a lot, keeps writing. Some of you ask about what she was doing, and yeah, she keeps writing. She has like many books. She's super prolific. So yeah, if you want to, some of them have been written or translated into English. A lot of them are still in just in French, right? She wins the Prix Medicis in 1969, which is a very important literary prize for a novel called Dedans, or Inside, right? Okay, so I don't want to make this super long lecture, even though it's very, very complex, as you saw the text, right? So, but I want for us to think about a little bit for our discussion on Thursday. I think I don't think tomorrow I'm gonna be having time to do it, but anyway, to think about our discussion of this text and then of Wittig as well, right? So many things here that are very complex, right? Because of context. Because of she's speaking to a particular audience, she's speaking to a particular intellectual environment in France, and France has a very different tradition than the American tradition, right? So one of the words that keeps coming that I want for us to think about here a lot is the word phallogocentric, right? We see this phallogocentrism, and that's a term that comes from her and another philosopher called Jacques Derrida, right? And as you can figure it out pretty easily just by the etymology, right? Like phallogocentrism, which the idea of not only a male-centered society, right? The patriarchy, as we tend to call it more in English, right? But also the idea of the phallus not only as and it comes here a lot with the penis envy and so on, not so much as like the actual male organ, but as the symbol of power, right? Like she talks about the scepter, right? Like the scepter of the king, right? So the idea of if there's a patriarchy existing, right, where everything turns around the patriarch, right? In this case, that patriarch is symbolized by the figure of the phallus, right? Which is not only the direct term for a sexual organ, but also for power in general, right? Like for the king has the scepter, right? The king builds pyramids and builds monoliths, right? And all these structures that are erected and that are supposed to signify power in general, right? So when we talk about phallocentrism, right, we're talking about that. Now, that word gets complicated by phallogocentrism, right? So we're mixing phallos with logos, right? And we already talked about logos in other classes, right? Meaning two words or two things in particular, right, that we have to keep in mind when we talk about logos. One is reason, right? And the other one is word, right? So language and reason, right? And what Cixous is here talking about, and what is so revolutionary about what she's trying to say, is precisely that there has been an essential link in our Western tradition between reason, what we determine as what is reasonable, what must be done, right? Because it's the right thing to do according to our understanding of the world, right? Our rationality. Think about the Enlightenment, right? And the word, right? So some of you ask, this question about like, well, how much would two things you ask that are related to this, right? Like how much would history change if it was written by women, right? And then the other one is a question that keeps you guys keep asking that comes here is why does Cixous give such a significance to writing as the terrain, the place where this battle is going to be fought, right? Like where the battle for recognition and a change is to be fought. And this comes from this, right? It comes the idea comes from the link between reason, what we term determinate that is the reasonable thing to do, the smart thing, the intelligent, right? In the real, the true thing to do, right? In terms of like what, as reason is what this shows us what the true state of the world should be and so on, right? And the word, which is text, right? How it has been written, right? So think about also in terms of our tradition, which is, we talked about it in class as well, which is the Judeo-Islamic Christian tradition, right? Greco-Roman, of course, but so it will be a Greco-Roman, Judeo-Christian, Islamic tradition, right? And the three religions there, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, of course, being the religions of the book, right? So being religions of revelation, right? And revelation having been done through meaning the revelation of the divine word, right? So this is, remember when we talk about in the beginning, there was the Logos, right? Like in the Gospel of John, right? The word is, it gets translated as in the beginning there was the word, right? But it could also be translated as in the beginning there was reason, right? So there's this link, right? So the point of Cixous is if all history and all the systems of thought have been written in connection, right, with this masculine desire of power, right? Like with this masculine attempt at repressing not only, and this is a big part of our text, right? Repressing not only women, but repressing all kinds of minorities, right? All the colonized, she talks about. She also talks about the link that our tradition has made between the feminine or women and the black continent, right? So in this case, would be like Europe against Africa, right? So pointing out to this, the way that the patriarchy has worked always with colonialism hand in hand, right? Like, so it's an exploitation not only of women, but it's an exploitation of all kinds of minorities and of the main minority in terms of European colonialism, which would be Africa, right? And then, of course, in the U.S., and all like the development of slavery will have to do with this same exploitation, right? And Cixous, as a footnote, also is known for fighting a lot for the French African ex-colonial subjects, right? So Algerians. Again, she's from Algeria. Even though her family came actually from the Czech Republic, originally to Algeria, they came from Czech Republic and Germany. She still grew up like in Algeria, which is pretty much an African country, as we know, right? So anyway, this is the main crux of the problem, right? The problem is that all writing, because it has been done mostly by men, right? And because not only that, but it's always trying to defend, protect this power, right? Like and use the minorities, and especially, for example, the case of women, as you guys, for example, mentioned it of like a phenomenon that we have in our culture a lot, which is like the over sexualization of women, right? And Cixous, if you notice in the text, when she talks about it, she talks about it kind of in the middle of the text when she goes and says like, well, there are these representations of and this is also answering to another question that you guys had, right? About like why the use of the Medusa, right? And the main point is saying like the Medusa it's a figure that gets put to women a lot together with or in conjunction with the abyss, right? The idea that women can be this, and you guys use the word a lot, right? Like can be this monster, right? Again, the monster as what goes against reason, right? Going again with phallogocentrism, right? So the woman will be like the monster that does not fit that reasonable world, right? So that's why it gets linked to the Medusa, right? And it's a monster that you have to defeat, right? But because it carries the dangerous trait of beauty, right? And seduction, right? Like that's why you have to use a mirror, right? Like to like what Perseus does in order to kill her, right? But also this idea of the abyss, right? Like the idea of the abyss as what cannot, what gets you dizzy, what cannot be understood, like what gets literally what makes you lose all control of reason, right? And then she says, in connection with this, how these tropes, right, of the monster, the seductive monster as Medusa, and then the abyss that reason cannot comprehend, right? And you can think here of the Greek monsters like the Charybdis and all these ocean kind of like figures that are supposed to be feminine, right? What Cixous says is like in this tradition, what you see is also a linking of the tropes of two tropes: death, right? The death, the idea of death, the figure of death, and the feminine sex, right? So the idea of we link this female sexuality, but especially the figure of the dangerous woman, right, as a seductress, with death, right? Like, and here there are other kind of hypothesizations, we will say, right? Like this kind of like creation of tropes where, you know, you could see it we read the Arabian Nights, right? So we have like the unfaithful woman, and like all of them will be unfaithful, and they will just hurt and create this pain in the male ones, right? And then you see that what we saw mentioned when we were reading Dr. Faustus, even though Marlowe doesn't have this exactly here, although the role of gender is also tricky there, but in the Goethe version, the German version that we mentioned, right? Like I told you that at the end, just before Faust or Faustus is about to be taken to hell because of the pact that he made, right? What saves him in this German tradition is Nietzsche mentioned that, or we mentioned this in our class, Nietzsche class, right? What saves him is the eternal feminine, right? The ewige Weibliche, right? Like that's the thing. So it's kind of this. Another trope of making either, you know, the monstrous seductive woman, like the abyss that is incomprehensible, right? Like Freud at some point will say, like, you know, the biggest mystery in the history of human thought will be what women want, right? Like this idea of being a desire that is just not, you know, yeah, like just an enigma, right? And we see it even in memes like nowadays, right? Like this idea of like, men being like, oh, they are so like mysterious and enigmatic, and in the meme the woman being like, no, I want, you know, I want to trust you, I want to be safe, I want to, you know, be respected, like just very very normal and reasonable things, right? But there is this trope of like the enigma. So that is one of the things that she's trying to say, and again, that's why it has to do with writing, right? Like writing as also not only because writing is where history gets made, and writing is where revealed religion gets exposed, right? Or where reason gets translated, right? Like in science, right? Like scientific writing. Think about the Enlightenment, but think about the other thing that gets written, which is the law, right? So the law precisely that suppresses and oppresses minorities, right? The law that oppresses women, and the law that oppresses minorities in the US and in Europe and in general, right? So that's another reason why writing needs to, for Cixous to be renewed, to be a new kind of writing, right? Like that, I'm answering one of your questions there, which was also very good about why talk about the new woman. And it has to do with really the newness of what breaks, right? Like we're talking with a break of tradition, right? It's not an adjustment of tradition. When the whole tradition, right, of what is being written does not allow systematically, right? When we talk about problems like systemic racism, right? Here we're talking also about a systemic sexism, right? Linked to racism, and of course, and homophobia and transphobia and all the minority, all the things that get oppressed in order for a patriarchy or a phallogocentric view to function, right? So when that is the system, like you can't, that's why it's so radical. It's like you can't just like, you know, change a little bit because then this is the system keeps going, right? Like what you're trying to do is to get another kind of the word she uses is syntax, right? Like we need another kind of syntax. And what she says is like it's not, yes, like it has been a minority of writers who have done that, like who have managed to write in this feminine way, right, in this new way. It has happened, but not many. She gives three examples. One we're going to read next week, which is Marguerite Duras with The War, and she was a French writer. The other one is Colette, another French writer of the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. The third one that she mentions is very interesting, and I usually teach some of his texts in my class, but this semester I decided not to because I wanted to do other things. But the other person is Jean Genet, who was a gay writer in France, very important. He also came to the U.S. at some point to fight next to, or to protest next to the Black Panthers. He was very involved with the civil rights movement in the U.S. Right. So anyway, like she's saying, like there have been writers who have approached this what she calls feminine writing, right? Like, and then she talks also about a good kind of bisexual writing, right? Like she tries to make a distinction between two different kinds of bisexual writing, right? Like one is the one that is supposed to just be this healing of this kind of like idea of kind of like a masculine writer that masculine writing that on top of everything can also incorporate the feminine and be like safe, right? And she's like, no, that's not a bisexual writing per se. That's more like a neutral writing, right? She talks about you need a kind of writing that still doesn't embrace and comprehends but respects difference, right? And this is kind of the main thing that Cixous is talking about here, right? That I want for us to distinguish, right? And it's also one of the main things that happens in feminism in France at this time. The point is that it's not a matter of absolute, let's say, of making like the feminine writing just be exactly as the male writing, right? Like it's not a matter of like equating everything, right? It's a matter of respecting the difference, but especially of respecting the difference, appreciating the difference, and the differences rather. And the question here is like not making them into oppositions, right? That is the main point about this like gender question for these writers at this moment, right? The idea is like it's not that equality will make everything the same. It is that we don't know how to deal with difference. We don't know how to deal with the other, right? Like she talks a lot about the other, right? Learn how to love the other as other, right? And this takes us also to another kind, to other types of differences and other kinds of like political minorities and gender minorities and so on, right? The idea being not to respect it and accept it as the richness of life without making it into an opposition, right? Without making it into women being the opposite of men and having to either fight it, right? The idea of love as war, or to what is the word I'm looking for? To fulfill, right? Like the idea of like a woman, what it has to do is to feel the lack, right? She talks about the lack a lot, right? To feel the lack of men, right? That's kind of the point. She's like, no, it's not about that. It's not this illusion of like now, going back to that Aristophanes myth that I mentioned to you that Plato talks about in the Symposium, right? When he says Aristophanes like that the reason why there's love and sexuality is because like usually back in the day human beings were these bisexual creatures, or rather hermaphroditic creatures, right? And they just split, right? Even though Aristophanes also mentioned that these hermaphroditic or these double creatures actually they had different genders, so it will be like male, female, combinations, male, female, and so on, right? So anyway, the main point here that she's making is not a matter of let's stop making that difference into an opposition, right? So again, let's stop making it dualistic, right? Like that's what she talks a lot about, being more than one always, right? And embracing this multiplicity, right? Like let's stop considering that it is always about a duality that has to be matched, right? So that's kind of like the main context that I can give you. I know I'm running a little long here, so I don't want to keep going too much with this, right? But the last thing I want to mention, right, like it's like there's a lot of terms that have to do with like not only the body and sexuality, of course, but these terms are always linked to psychoanalysis, right? So something to think about is, well, two things. One, psychoanalysis in the U.S. changed a lot, and it's a practice that is not that big, especially in small, like in more smaller cities, right? Like in New York and Chicago, it's still big. But in the US, it's not a big thing. But it is a big thing in France and Europe, right? So like psychoanalysis is kind of the therapy par excellence, we'll say, right? And sometimes, for example, when in France they were discussing a gay marriage a couple of years ago and passing the law, psychoanalysts will be called to come and give their opinions because it's kind of the official therapy for the state. So, and this is and Cixous is living in France, so she's writing about it in this way, right? And she disagrees with a lot of things, right? But this makes it that because the psychoanalytical discourse, which is Freudian but post-Freudian, you have other writers. She's pretty much thinking about Jacques Lacan at this time, which was a psychoanalyst from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, who was focused mostly in language. So that's another context. But when she's talking about that, and she talks about things like phallogocentrism, as we mentioned, but also like penis envy, right? The point here is not so much, don't think it in terms like of literally, like, oh, it's this like an old trope of, and sometimes we understand Freud, or Freud gets understood in this literal way that is not exactly how he meant it. It's not uh, always or directly thought in terms of like biology, like, oh, literally, like the woman has the envy for penis, but it's rather in more symbolic terms, right? Like penis envy is more the idea of women are, according to Freud, in this tradition, right? Like they are seen and they understand themselves, right, as lacking, right, as lacking something, as lacking the power, lacking the role, the hierarchical role, right? Like, so that's what this means, right? And then obviously that could be put into other or minority or lesser roles in this hierarchy, right? So like just as women are having the envy of having this power, right? The phallus, the scepter, and so on. So minorities will have the same envy to be the superior, right? Or the one on top, right? Like the one at the top of the hierarchy, right? So that's what she's also trying to move beyond, right? It's saying like no, and that's what she's saying. Like if we allow this kind of running to happen, right? If this happens, then all these hierarchies are going to be changed, right? And that's what she mentions, and this is something I wanted to mention before we go here. The idea of another economy, right? The idea of especially something that we think more about right now, where questions of feminism and like LGBTQ struggles or studies or theory, when we mix all of this together, right, we're also always talking about economy, right? And we're talking about the links between the kind of order that we have that is patriarchal, that is sexist, with the capitalistic system, right? And Cixous is kind of going in this vein when she's saying, it's not coming exactly from a Marxist perspective, but she is coming from this point of being like economy as we live it, right, has to do with this idea of exchange, right? This idea of like, what you give me something, I give you something back, right? And she's saying, if we think in a new kind of way with like this feminine writing that is about differences, then it's not anymore, because difference is not opposition, so it's not give and take. It can also be just give and give and give, and kind of create a very different plurality of economies, right? And think about economy in its etymological sense, right? Of oikos, which is the house, and nomos, the law of the house, right? So we can think of a different kind of house in terms, and she says it at some point very strongly, right? Like the idea of how kind of the masculine is more local, right? Is worried about like propriety, right? And property, both propriety and property, right? Like what is proper and what is owned, right? Private property, think about that. And the female thinking more about the universe or the world, right? Like a kind of more of an idea of sharing, right? And where we are right now, as I am recording this because we're in isolation, facing a pandemic, right? A disease that affects all the world. These questions kind of come further, right? With an idea of if Cixous, and I hope she will talk about this soon, and I'll try to see if I can find what she says, right? But if Cixous' desire of a different kind of writing that is like stretch up to different socio-political system, if it had its way, right, will we, for example, be more worried about helping each other in the whole world instead of within our own borders, right? Only spaces, right? That's a question that comes there. Anyway, I'm gonna let you go. Sorry, I went a little too long today, but it's a very rich text, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with you guys on Thursday. Maybe if tomorrow we have time, we can do it, but if not, we'll move on Thursday. So yeah, thank you guys, and sorry that I was looking like one side or the other. I'm still new at this thing. Okay, have a good rest of the day or night, depending on when you watch